Well, you know, it's not an urgent, not an emergency, but it is something that can get done. You got it, buddy. Thank you so much. All right. Take care. Go ahead, man.
Good. I just keep going to see.
Is anybody gonna do it at one time? Charles Virtual. Frank Young. Joe Kelly. I want to see these people interact. I want to see
That's like Candace,
I don't do it as long as
that's not Candace. And I think
Can't
that's
do it. Oh, up top?
Candace here.
Candace
on the left.
herself? Okay.
And I think that's Danielle Swallow right behind.
No, it's Jennifer Holmes. She's with Denrac.
Now, I presume the minutes from these meetings are online?
They will be.
Not this one, but in the past ones?
They will be. They're not at the moment.
Okay.
They haven't been approved yet.
Well, last night. Were you here, did you come last night? For the meeting?
No.
It's not about those rappers.
Yeah,
Hey, Rodney, how you doing?
Hey, how are you?
All right.
Nick?
Mayor, Ted. Hey, how are you? Ted, how you doing?
How are you?
Hello.
Rodney, how are you?
I'm well, how are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Hello, Janelle. How are you? I am good, I think. This day has gone by too quickly. But most of them seem to do that.
The older you get.
Isn't that the truth? It really does. Fly by. All right. All right.
Do you want us to wear masks?
If you're vaccinated, you can take them off.
I'm back.
Okay?
Thank you, I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, no. That's the way we've been operating is basically, if you're vaccinated, have any of you gotten your third vaccine yet, or your booster yet?
As soon as Moderna gets approved, I'll be flying.
Yeah, I got mine about 2 weeks ago. That's great.
Is Moderna?
No, I have Pfizer.
Yeah, Moderna hasn't gotten
Pfizer,
approved
but I
yet,
haven't been-
as far as I know.
I haven't gotten a booster, but I've got natural immunities because I had it in January.
Oh, well, that's good. Yeah, Rite Aid has it.
For Pfizer?
I got it there 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Very easy, no appointment,
Just walk in and get it.
yeah. Yeah.
Just do what I have to tell
You're well behaved there.
him. He's the professional.
Yeah. I'm sure your clients don't do that either, so. Hey, Rick.
I've learned in my career that the more money you charge, the more they listen.
Yeah, sometimes.
You do things for free,
Well, I think, you know.
which is a shame.
Yeah,
They're streaming, just so everybody's aware.
yeah, we're having this conversation and with everybody. It's,
Yes, okay.
yeah, we're good. I don't think we're talking about anything.
No, I was.
Yeah, great.
Ted, what was the meeting about last night on the rental tax?
We were just talking, the meeting last night was the initial discussion about the possibility of restructuring rental tax into short and long term and how we might do that. There'll be a lot more public input. It was just an initial discussion. It was recorded. It'll be on, you can take a look at it.
It's on YouTube now.
That's the,
Yeah, we have two members we know are not going to participate because they're out of,
Right.
so,
Was it the commercial tax or was that the residential?
residential?
It's not about, it wasn't necessarily about tax, it was just about long-term versus short-term rentals in general. So it wasn't tax specific.
No, it was about, there was a discussion about, what does a short-term rental strain put on versus a long-term rental strain on, need for parking, need for trash pickup, need for those kinds of things, and,
I think we've got everybody
okay,
that's going to be here.
all right. I see Jan.
You see him?
I see Jen.
Oh.
She's
Yeah.
in the center.
I'm here.
You are right, you are front and center in this Hollywood Squares that we're looking at.
I've got 4 across, I can't even be in the center. Like Brady Bunch look there.
Okay. Well,
Okay, so who do you have in person with you?
okay, we have a Rodney Robinson,
Okay,
committee member, and Dennis Reardon, former council member, Nick Carter, who we've met before, and Rick Quill, who just stepped out, but he'll be back, as well as Janelle Cornwall and Anne Marie.
fantastic. Okay, so on my screen, I'm not seeing Marta
I'm not
or
seeing Marty.
Jim Baker.
You're right, I don't see either of them.
And nobody else is in the we have 2 members in the attendees, but
Okay,
nobody else on the panel.
well, let me call Marta.
I can't.
Hey, Marty, you gonna join us?
Yeah, just like your text, I'm here for reception. I should be able to get better.
Okay, very good.
Yes, it's more like classes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
No problem, thank you, bye-bye. Marta just said she's having some difficulty with reception, but she's trying again. Okay, Baker. We'll call Jim and see what he's got.
Hello, thank you for calling Pilot Town Engineering, consulting structural.
Oops. Oh, Jim Baker. Send him a text. How did we live before cell phones?
you were very patient.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
All right, I sent Jim a text.
I guess we'll just give 1 minute for see if Marta can get
Yep.
through her technical difficulties and join us
Right.
before we start.
Hey, Jen,
Yes,
I emailed you about 15 minutes ago because I couldn't find the Zoom link. You can ignore me. I didn't realize the link is actually in the agenda now, so I guess we don't get a separate email.
I mean, this was,
Which is fine.
it is easier if we get the separate email sometime, but I did respond to your email as well. I
Oh,
sent
you
you
did?
the
Okay.
agenda, so,
All right,
yep.
thanks.
It was right there.
Jim's here, good. Okay. Terrific. We still don't have Marta yet, right? Okay. Aha. Marta's issue is that she's in upstate New York.
You might be having some cell issues.
So if Jim's here, perhaps we should go ahead, and I think there's no point in waiting. We've already waited about 6-7 minutes, so let's go ahead and get started for 10 minutes, okay? Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just want to say thank you, as always, for everyone for joining us this afternoon. So our meeting overview today, we have two basic parts. The first half of the meeting will be focused on the committee debriefing. And then the second part will take another 20-25 minutes to do a presentation by BJ, providing an overview to the roles and responsibilities of different levels of government as they pertain to elements of flooding and sea level rise. The goal of that presentation is basically so that you members understand what the City of Lewis can and cannot control, and therefore where your recommendations will be most effective. But before we get into the committee debriefing, I just want to take 5 seconds and just say thank you so much for your patience. BJ and Phil and I were speaking earlier this week and just saying that, you all have sat through many presentations over the past 6 weeks and have been very patient. I hope that you have found the time with the expert presenters, giving you the latest data and science has been helpful for you. We know that many of you are familiar with some of the issues, but not everybody on the committee. And obviously for the committee to operate at its best, we need everybody to have kind of that baseline starting point. But today we changed that. So we spent some time this first half listening to your opinions and your thoughts and perceptions of the issues as they pertain to the City of Lewis right now. We would like to continue focusing on the perception of the challenge and defining what the problem really is that we're facing. And we want to just sent emailed a couple of questions to everyone last week so you'd have a little bit of time to prepare. Just a couple of items. We remember our ground rules. There are 8 of us on the call now, 9 of us on the call now, so we have probably 2 to 3 minutes for each person to speak, and we really do want to hear from everyone. And so, just want to encourage that. So the 2 questions were, 1, what were your key takeaways from the presentations? And 2, based on those takeaways, how critical do you think the issues of coastal flood or just flooding and sea level rise are for the City of Lewis? And if you want to put a rating on that, where 1 would be not critical and 5 would be absolutely critical, that would just be kind of really helpful for the planning team as well as your fellow members to kind of figure out where it is that you fall in terms of looking at the issues and as we move forward into the solutions. So with that, I am going to open up. Are there any volunteers?
Looks like
Candace, excellent, thank you.
So some of this is quite new to me, and what I took away from the presentations was that Lewis is very susceptible to both sea level rise and flooding in all its forms, and we've experienced it up close and personal. So I don't think there's a question about whether it's a critical issue for us. What I did take away, and I hope to learn more today with your discussion about what elements the city can actually make adjustments to in its code and other matters, is how we can improve safety for the residents of the city of Lewis. I think about it pretty much in terms of emergency situations, but I'm sure that there are going to be some other areas that we'll want to focus on that are not necessarily emergency in nature, but rather avoiding property damage and things of that nature, given the costs that we learned about during the presentations that were made in the prior weeks. So my takeaways were a very serious issue. I'm glad to be a part of this and to learn how we can assist the city with some recommendations in making it safer for the residents and to protect property.
Great. So in terms of the 1 to 5, we give it a 5, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Don't want to put words into your mouth, but just want to confirm that. Okay.
Like Joe Kelly.
Hey, Joe. Okay, thank you.
I have a little different take on the seriousness of the problem. I think there are certain areas of the beach, for example, that are a important issue. The flooding from the canal, which affects right now some of the properties south, west of the of Cedar Street, including the California Street, and then there's the whole. But as far as the city is concerned, we really haven't addressed the issues there, as I see it. And I just don't understand. It seems to me it's not so much a sea level rise there, or a lesser extent. It may be simply a rainfall issue with respect to certain properties. I just can't distinguish in my own mind that. I think the most critical issue facing Lewis as far as flooding is the wastewater facility. And of course that's not within our remit, but I really think that you can't isolate that issue all. I also believe that we need to look, we were going to consider the flood hazard ordinance, and I think there's really some provisions there that need to be changed. For example,
Actually, sorry, Joe, just interrupt. Before we go into solutions, because you're taking to the next step, can we just confirm? So it sounds like you're not sure that sea level rise particularly is a critical issue, but flooding is. I don't want to put, again, I'm not putting words in your mouth, I just want to.
Flooding is in certain areas, yes. Sea level rise, what is the connection between sea level rise and the flooding from the canal? Now, I know there's been a committee that's been set up to look at how to deal with flooding from the canal. I would like to hear from them. I understand their thoughts are not finalized, but I think in order for us to do our job, we need to hear what solutions they may have in mind for addressing that issue. So overall, and I think just with respect to some of the projections that John Callahan had presented, they seem to be out of line with what I see from NASA and what I see from NOAA. And I've asked John in 2 separate emails that he could provide the basis for that, and I've not received a response. And so I think we need to make sure that whatever our decision's based on, it's based on the best data that's available. And John's projections may be right, but there's several other models and how predictable really are they. And we're talking about maybe basing decisions on what it may happen in 2070, and that may or may happen, and you've got to consider the individual property rights here. You just can't force people into situations where they may have not had any flooding on their property, but if they need repairs that amount to 50% of the market value of the structure over 10 years, they're forced into these flooding provisions. I think that's wrong. I think that pertains to businesses and individual homeowners.
Okay, thank you. And again, we don't want to get too far into, past committee recommendations or past ordinance proposals. We want to, this is our committee, and we want to take a fresh start and look forward. So thank you for the input at that point. Would anybody else like to take their turn? Chris, thank you.
Yeah, so I think I'd echo a little bit of what Candace said and what Joe said. This is really hard. I mean, it's a lot of information. It's a lot of data on things that may occur in a really long time frame. It's really hard to get your arms around thinking about millimeters worth of sea level rise each year, 5 or 6 millimeters, it's difficult to think about that being a major issue anytime soon. And, I definitely would look at what Candace said as far as the safety issue for the city and things that we may be able to come up with from that standpoint, whether it's thinking about the roads leading into and out of the city, New Road and some of the issues over there with the water coming up and over the road and it being one of the only ways out of the city. I definitely am kind of interested in that. Insurance was kind of a key point for me in the flood insurance presentation. Just, I'm in the mortgage business, so I deal a lot with that. And I learned quite a bit about, what goes on behind the scenes with the National Flood Insurance Program and risk rating and how the city participates. I found it interesting that, the way the city does participate in some of the incentives that are out there for the city to do more, what I took away from that was there wasn't much of an impact there from a cost perspective for the city to really try to do much with their rating with FEMA. At least that was my opinion. And, we've got that new risk rating system is starting in a few days. I've actually tried to learn a little more about that from some of the insurance companies around town. And interestingly, they don't have any information on it. They really don't know what these new flood premiums are going to look like. I asked some pretty pointed questions about, specific type housing and locations on the beach, and they really don't know. So we're going to find out here in the next week or so, and I might be able to help with, bringing some data on how that's going to look going forward. As far as rating, the urgency of the situation here with flooding in general, I would put it at, my opinion so far is I'd put it at a 3.
Thank you. Interesting.
Rodney here, who would like to.
Yes. Rodney, okay, great.
Yes, I've been having a hard time getting my arms around it too, because it seems like we have two big issues. One is this sea level rise, which, if you believe the worst, it's catastrophic. I'm not quite sure what to say about that, even if it's 50 years away or 100 years away. But I find myself really, in terms of questions, asking about more localized things. And I have questions about, have we done any effective modeling about flooding say, over the last 10 years? Do we know that our infrastructure is capable or not capable? What parts of it need to be improved? I don't know. Are we going to go through that or find that out? People have talked about the sewage treatment plant seems to be one of the most vulnerable. Are there other areas that are the most vulnerable that we should be thinking about as we go through this? I'd kind of like to see a list of things with some prioritization given to them. That might help us, point us in certain directions in terms of finding solutions or making recommendations. I guess I would give it a 3 too. I think it's very important what we're doing. But the other thing is I keep thinking about, all this water that has to get out of the bay. And the more we keep developing, the county lets the developing continue like it is, even though they go through the best management practices and all those things, we know that we're still going to get more water heading this way. And in Lewis, it's got to get out to the Roosevelt Inlet. And if it can't, it backs up. So, is there anything we can do about that? I don't know. Should we be working not just with FEMA, but also with the county in a more effective way? Perhaps that there's something that could be done there. I don't know. It is important. I would give it a 3.
Great, thank you. Khalil.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Jen. This definitely has been quite an enlightening experience thus far. I know I've learned a lot, and I think I'm echoing what a lot of people have said as well. And there's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more to unlearn. There's been a lot of information on sea level rise, some of it very, very credible, some of it questioned by some. Although I'm happy that we're beyond where we probably were 10 years ago, where there were a lot of people who didn't believe in it. And now at least we're confronting a threat that may not be imminent, but is on the way. The other parts of flooding, from tidal flooding, from rainwater, really add a whole new dimension to this. That's been mentioned. Obviously, sea level rise is critical, but a lot of our flooding comes from the marsh. So it's not necessarily coming from the bay and other places. To touch on what Rodney just mentioned, one of the things I've taken away thus far is that we can't, although it's instructive to review what other communities have done and are doing and how they're addressing it, one size fits all approach hardly ever works. And we do need to be, and I hope we're moving towards a more localized, understanding of what we have here in Lewis, what our advantages are against flooding. For example, I read recently in our comp plan that Lewis is 53% open space, which I found to be quite, if I was asked to guess, I would have guessed that number was a lot lower. So how do we manage that? How do we incorporate that in terms of our mitigation efforts? So obviously we're not here today to discuss mitigation strategies, but I do think whatever they end up being, I hope we take a very localized approach to our community and understand where the real threats are and where some areas aren't as threatening and focus on them as opposed to just one blanket approach.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you were going to give a rating, did you want to put a number on it or not?
Yeah, I'll put a 4. I'm going to try to keep diversifying that number.
Understood. Great. Let's see. So we haven't heard from Frank, Marta, Jim, or Drew. Who would like to go next? Drew, thank you.
I understand where Khalil is coming from, but I take a slightly different approach in hearing the data, some of which I've heard for the 3rd or 4th time from some of the same people over the last 3 or 4 years. I think we have a short-term problem and a long-term problem, and they are not identical. We do have 3 levels of flooding, which is tidal, groundwater, and sea level rise. that are going to be affected by what the communities around us do. So I do think we need first and foremost to address the Lewis situation as best we can, but we are dependent, as others have said, on both the county and the other coastal towns and how they affect us and what they do or don't do to protect all of us from flooding. So I think the solutions we need to look at, I'm not going to get into specifics, do have a local nexus, but we also can't ignore the relationship with the surrounding communities and determine how that impacts us. And as has been said, when we look at New Road with the new developments going in there with hundreds of new homes, do we really know what Canary Creek impact is going to be? Do we know how much that's going to impact the city? And I think that's an unknown issue. I also agree with the notion that our current ordinance structure is lacking. One reason that there have been some suggestions for changes, but I do think we need to address those. And Khalil, I'm going to go you one better. I'm going to give it a 5. I think flooding in broad sense needs to be addressed, but the bifurcation between local and relationship with the other coastal communities and the county, I think is something we can't ignore.
Great. Okay, so Jim, Marta, or Frank? Frank. Thank you.
Well, I think the idea that Lewis is attempting to do something about flooding isn't even remotely new. I was involved with a joint project between the city and FEMA. Gosh, it's probably been 19, 20 years ago at this point, in which we elevated a number of homes, primarily, if not all, on Lewis Beach, to be above the base flood elevation at the time. So, this isn't a new thing. But I also think that we need to be very careful, much like Joe Kelly said, that whatever our recommendations are, that we keep very much in the forefront the rights of the property owners. Otherwise, you end up with, you create a disparity and possibly even a taking. So I think we need to be cognizant of that. Now, is flooding important? Yes, it's important. Is sea level rise important? Yes, it is. But I think we also need to answer those questions. Let's just chat about sea level rise. Answer the sea level rise question of, well, is it going to rise 10 feet between now and Christmas? Because that means we evacuate. Obviously, the answer is no, but I'm just making a point here. Or is it going to rise 1 inch in the next decade? And our courses of action are very different with either of those two scenarios. Obviously, it's somewhere in the middle. So, I think about flooding as a weak 3, maybe a fair to middling 2.5, and sea level rise along the same lines. I think we just need to be very thoughtful and cognizant, particularly of property rights.
Okay.
I could say something, but I did miss the beginning, and so I'm not sure what the scale is that we're talking about.
So the scale is 1 to 5, where 1 is not critical at all, and 5 is most critical.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I've listened to the presentations, and they are consistent with all of the science I've reviewed in the past, even when I was working as a biologist with National Marine Fisheries Service. We took into account sea level rise and climate change when we decided to list species as threatened or endangered. Every time the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change came up with a new report, it proved to be at least and worse. The conditions showed, confirmed that there was concern, and they actually were worse. So I see reason for concern, and I wanted to keep that in mind. I would like to rely on the best available and scientific information that we have. Property rights are important, but also property rights of others are important. I don't think the ordinances we have in the city, they say we can't impact other people's lands with water. There's no there's no way of getting people for that. I mean, I've seen examples where there's been flooding due to somebody else's new patio or roof or whatever in the small lots, and it's very difficult to prove. So it doesn't happen. Nobody gets compensated for the problem that they have in their yard because of a neighbor. And I think that's very important in looking at these new developments coming on New Road and elsewhere. The water has to go somewhere, as I think Drew mentioned, or maybe Khalil or Rodney. I can't keep track. But anyway, and there are a lot of developments, and maybe there is 53% open space, but I think it matters where that open space is. If you have it all in one area, it's not going to help all the other areas with impervious surface. I think we are in trouble. We are in an area, the whole area here, just like Hampton Roads area, Newport News, Virginia Beach. I mean, we are in an area that it's very vulnerable to sea level rise, and I would like to do something. I would like to provide some recommendations where we can do something as a city. And so I have to give it a rating of 5.
Thank you. Okay, Jim, that leaves you.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Yeah, I'll just keep mine real short. I agree with quite a few of the panelists. It's certainly an issue that we need to be cognizant of. It is from the data that was presented to us. And correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like over the past 20, 30 years, the level of water rising has, or the rates has increased. However, I think we need to be cognizant of our actions to not have such knee-jerk reactions. So I would put us at around a 3 for the critical level, mainly because I would like to see the town have a longer-term plan in order to follow, to help with mitigation processes that works for everyone in the city, not just singling out the homeowners that are in floodplains and just looking at their properties, but doing other items that the city can help support and can help fund to help mitigate the effects of some of these storms. The term resiliency, which is the name of this committee, is really boils down to, how quickly can you recover from such events. And we do need to look at our town services that we feel, or if they do show to be vulnerable, we need to the city and everybody needs to look at those in order to be resilient, in order to recover quickly from events. So I do think this committee should start looking into and asking those questions, which I believe Rodney had mentioned in his statements, and so I would concur with those. But as far as the rating, I would definitely say a 3.
Great, thank you very much, Jim.
Jen, I don't know whether I gave a number. My wife was listening and she claimed not.
No, I was just going to go back to you, actually, to get that.
3 would be my number.
3? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, well, I want to thank you all again for putting some thought into what you've heard and what you think about the issues. It certainly helped us as a planning team to kind of map out the next few meetings and where we want to go. But just to keep us on time for today, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to BJ for the presentation on local government, or not local government, but government rules and regulations. And we'll take some questions at the end of that presentation as well. So, BJ, are you okay to go?
I am.
Excellent.
All right, let's see. Is my presentation up?
Yes.
All right, good evening, everybody. we've all met before, but I'm BJ DeCourcy. I'm a planner at the Biden School of Institute of Public Administration. Been working with for Phil and with Jen on this since the very beginning. And I have the unenviable task today of trying to walk through all regulation at every level that pertains to sea level rise, climate change, and the different types of flooding. So I want to start at the very beginning of saying that before, if you could resist the urge to jump in and tell me that I'm missing huge chunks of stuff, because it's impossible to be entirely inclusive with a scope this wide. Also, I am not an expert really on any of these things, but even the things that I know some about, there are people on this call right now that know more about every single facet of this than I do. So if you could just bear with me as we kind of move through, I think it becomes kind of apparent what we're getting at as we move on. So like I say, we're trying for the 30,000 foot view, excuse me, essentially of who is in charge of what and what's in our wheelhouse as it comes to addressing climate change and sea level rise. So obviously there's the federal government, we have the whole state of Delaware, we have Sussex County, the largest by geographic area in the state, and then we have, little tiny Lewis. So it would seem like, where would the power be? But I think you'd be a little surprised as we get to the end as to who really has authority over a lot of the regulations or different approaches that could be most pertinent. Also, another caveat I forgot to throw in the beginning is, although we do make some references to Lewis's Code and various other pieces of legislation, it is the next executive committee meeting, right, Jen, where we're really digging into the codes of Lewis, another area that I'm not an absolute expert at. So as we look at national or even international, and I'm going to kind of push through this because it's pretty obvious to a group like this, but when we're talking about mitigating, reversing, dealing with climate change, things like the Paris Agreement and so on, that's not us. Things like greenhouse gas emissions, transportation and infrastructure spending, the power grid and how it's laid out and how it's transmitted, and batteries and storage and all the other things that are going to lead to global warming and so on, it's kind of way beyond our purview. Now, there are things that are closer to home. We've had a couple of great presentations on the NFIPs, the different standards that are, the minimum standards that are put out there, and of course the option to enhance those standards. The Army Corps of Engineers and the various shoreline stabilizations and so on. But the point of this is that Lewis can't pass a law saying the Army Corps of Engineers has to put up a 10-meter seawall. I mean, you could pass that law, but you wouldn't get much for it. So, differing rules. And what is our influence at this level? I mean, to be really active and engaging on social media, perhaps, to move to West Virginia or Arizona, or to one area where we do have some pull is to stay in touch with the relevant state agencies. So when you're talking about Army Corps of Engineer projects, then you want to be engaged with DENREC, and not like you send them an email like you're engaged with them for 8 years, 12 years, 15 years, constantly keeping your needs top of mind. So as we move on to the state of Delaware, let's see, that controls the vast majority of all infrastructure spending. As we look at the strategy for state policies and spending, you'll see that the state has a very kind of transparent, spatial, what's called mappable policy of where it wants to grow and what it supports. As you look at all the Del laws such here, I mean, obviously this covers all the high points, but by and large, the state legislates minimum standards in which the counties or the municipalities will typically adopt or enhance. The state also has an important review role. That's the preliminary land use service. We already had a lot of talk about subdivisions and development. So all major subdivisions, all comprehensive plans, both things we've already been talking about today just in our preliminaries, are reviewed by the state, and these things are brought to the agencies for preliminary comment. And then also agency permitting, which is a couple slides down, but obviously LDOT, DENREC, Fire Marshal, Department of Education, are all have their own regulations that are based upon the legislation, so they will tell you yes or no. So as we look now at this is the state strategies for policies and spending. This might be a touch, just a hair dated. I think the update, the 2020 policies have been released, but the map visually is the same. So I realize that the legend might be a touch small, but there are 4 general levels that the state classifies the areas into. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 and 2 are really open for business. 3 is kind of emerging and developing, and 4 and out of play are discouraged. Now, this is not, and this is the distinction we'll talk about later, zoning. This is the state taking dozens and dozens or maybe hundreds of factors. They cut the whole state into tiny little 10-meter grids, and then the composite scoring of that comes up with these levels, all right? So that's the long way of saying is if you look for Lewis, despite the obvious environmental concerns and constraints, which state analysis does take into account, on the all of them, when you look at the, where are the roads, where are the schools, where's the development that's already happened, where's the transportation, Lewis is bright red. Lewis is open for business. So even with the myriad of policy concerns that this group is discussing, on the whole, the state analysis shows Lewis as a place that is favored for growth. So then as we get into kind of the two of the certainly more relevant agencies, and again, this is not a totally inclusive, there's a number of state agencies that would regulate and deal with this sort of thing, but DENREC, because that's going to be all things climate and environment, and then DELDOT, which is the lion's share of state investment, certainly in infrastructure. So now DENREC does have, 11 or 12 divisions, and a lot of them have a lot of regulatory authority. But if you would look with me just at here, so this is the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy. Look at the approach that DENREC, my mouse is kind of flaking out, but look at what they've chosen to focus on, all right? So, I'm sorry. So that's not going to work. You're going to have to squint your eyes a little bit. But their mission statement there is an integrated approach of applied science, so science, education, policy development, and incentives. So in this particular arena, DENREC is not heavily regulatory, although they certainly are in terms of water and pollution and fisheries and so on. When they're talking specifically about climate adaptation in the coastline, their favorite approaches are applied science, education, policy development, and incentives. Now, as you get to DELDOT, a lot of the same discussions that we were having earlier on about impervious surfaces, you're getting that kind of on steroids. So we might be talking about roofs or decks. DELDOT is talking about, are we talking about 2 lanes, 4 lanes, or 6 lanes? Just in terms of surface area. In terms of resiliency, the Department of the streets and subdivision guidelines that the state has are going to talk about the crown and the slope, how far raised up the roadway is, and so on and so forth. And these are standards that are adopted pretty much uniformly by every municipality, by every county, in all of their combined land use or subdivision ordinances. So the question kind of falls to this group and other concerned citizens in Lewis is, where are we special? Do we need a little more, much like we had the discussion with the NFIP? So just to put a finer point on it, this is from kind of Dover all the way on down to the remaining bits of Delaware. And the red are the state-maintained roads. The orange are also state-maintained. They're just owned, right? And the blue are the municipally maintained roads. So you get a sense of the scale of how much DELDOT has going on. About 90% of the road miles, and this is a touch data, but the story does not change. However, as you zoom in to the lovely city of Lewis, you can see that relative to a lot of other municipalities, Lewis has its own streets. Usually when you do this zoom in, and you're free to do it, they have a great map. I think if you type in Delaware road maintenance, it takes you right to this map. But most towns, it's mostly the yellows and the oranges and the reds. Whereas Lewis, you do have a lot of municipally maintained roads. So again, that's the question of, the group was talking about infrastructure and resiliency. So, is that an issue? Would Lewis much like we'll talk about with annexation, would Lewis accept dedication of roads that it didn't feel were already engineered or built to a resilient standard? Would they be willing to take on that cost? And so how do we have influence at the state level? Well, thankfully, Delaware is a pretty small place, and it's really no shortage. I mean, it's not that difficult to get a meeting with a senator or even the governor. There's a League of Local Governments. If you're talking about the varied state agencies, they are long on workshops. This is just for Sussex County, and they're ongoing. So it's not a 5 or 6 or 8 hour drive to Austin. It's an hour and 10 minutes, kind of at best, to Dover. And Delaware's long had kind of the Delaware way or the Delaware model, where it's not hard to get along. So now as we move into the discussion of the county level, the caveat that I'm going to throw out there is that there's a lot of redundancy, and so we're gonna lump them in a little bit. The same, we call it police power, but the same level of ordinance control is afforded to both the counties and the state. They're all creatures of the state. They all have charters. They're all, in essence, municipalities, just the counties are much, much bigger. So, with Sussex, there's flood ordinances. They have their own source water protection. They have building heights and so on, sediment and stormwater management, and these things are all mirrored in Lewis's code. There's some crossover. There's the Sussex Conservation District, which does the permitting for stormwater in both, because that is the designated agency. And also just, this may not be especially visible, but the little graphic on the bottom here is another illustration of Sussex County has the same exact street design standards as the state of Delaware. So again, we're seeing that minimum standard working its way on down. So just to talk a little bit about a matter of scale, and this is something else this group hit on much earlier. So again, I'm very cognizant that you can't see all these colors, but look at the map, and anything that is not a little blob of brown, if you see Lewis up here, the other little blobs of brown are the other municipalities in Sussex County. Anything that is not a little blob of brown is going to fall under the land use controls, regulations, ordinances, and so on, the purview of Sussex County. So as you're countenancing changes, adjustments, different approaches, it's helpful to keep in mind the matter of scale relative to the effectiveness that you might have, and also how you want to live and where you want to live. And even if we zoom this in, now the caveat here is that the kind of light yellow or the beige areas are only areas of concern, so these aren't areas that Lewis is likely to annex. However, the kind of rust-colored or darker light brown here, along with the pink, are areas of, and the open space, but less relevant to the conversation, are areas that Lewis would like to eventually annex. Now, I don't want to dive into annexation policy, but this is your 2015 plan. These are areas that are approved. If a petition were made or if agreement was reached, these are areas that could potentially become part of Lewis. And even just these little areas are, basically the size of town now. And these are also areas that are not regulated by Lewis presently. They are regulated by the county. So finally, kind of getting down closer to the local view, this is a slide borrowed from our Planning 101 presentation. Is just to say a few words about the importance of the comprehensive plan. Now, obviously, as a planner, and Jen will raise her hand also, and a number of people on this call, we love planning, but your comprehensive plan is the definitive policy document for any municipality. So when you undertake an important or transformative initiative, it's very helpful to have that policy spelled out in the comprehensive plan, because it's extra backing that you can always refer back to. Moreover, Delaware Code is specific with your zoning and by extension, your land use regulations have to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So if there's a change of vision that is then going to set off changes in the code, it's a lot easier if you bring the plan along for the ride, just for consistency's sake, for the public engagement process, for transparency, and for kind of a holistic effort. So now as we're talking about local regulations, kind of with sensitive areas, we're mirroring the county quite a bit. So you have your floodplain regulations, land use control, building codes, and wetlands. We know that the building code is the 2012 version, although that's, I guess, kind of in the process of being pushed up. We've had a number of presentations on the flood insurance rate maps as a baseline. However, your code, and just as common practice, there's no saying that you have to go strictly with what's on the firm maps. That's a matter of local purview. Stormwater design and function, that's the BPW, and then stormwater regulations. There's some codes in Lewis that talk about not discharging to the sanitary sewer, but by and large, those permits and those approvals are coming from the SCD. Then you have buffers for sensitive areas like tidal and non-tidal wetlands, wellheads, and so on, and then sea level rise and resiliency are all local ordinances that touch upon sensitive areas. And so this next slide is really a presentation all in and of itself, and I'm sure that a number of the people on this call are very familiar with this, but and you can see just as well as I can, since we're not going to be going into every one of these, that the existing code does address and have provisions for all these. It's a matter of what, if any, changes this group would want to make. Well, so we'll kind of wrap up, well, getting close to wrapping up, with the local purview. It doesn't really relate specifically to sensitive areas, just kind of all areas, since there seems to be some sort of consensus that this is a problem that affects, well, certainly some parts of Lewis more than others, but it's an issue for the entirety of Lewis. So you have the land use type, that's your zoning, kind of your zoning uses or the colors on the map. We'll come back to that in a moment. There's the dimensional characteristics, and this is, a lot of this has been discussed. Your street or subdivision standards, so what type of streets, what lot sizes, setbacks, and so on. Parking requirements are requiring off-street parking that would have an effect on imperviousness, side yard setbacks, lot coverage, well-worn territory for this group. Also, any municipality or any level of government essentially, but certainly Lewis and Sussex included, can just pass laws and raise taxes. They can pass new types of taxes. They can establish different sorts of funds, all things that would be within this group's purview to recommend. And then another that is a little bit easier to grasp would be annexation. So that would be to accept or pursue annexation, to conditionally accept or pursue annexation. So that's something the group could possibly think about is, yes, we want to grow. At what cost? Do we want to do a cost-benefit analysis? Do we want to take on someone else's problem? Of course, there's a lot of benefits to annexation also. And a similar thought with roads. There's a long history in Sussex of roads, of some roads that are private and perhaps not even built to the state standard. There's also roads that are built at a state standard, and is that an acceptable standard for a town that has such flooding concerns? Public-private, and so that kind of outlines, and as you think back to the last slide of what your code is, it's easy to see what sorts of things you can flat out regulate, but then the scope broadens out considerably if you step away from a regulatory approach, if you're talking about public-private partnerships or initiatives or volunteer programs or grant funding that the city might pursue, and then program for, here we're into, what the mind can imagine, and I'm not able to know what I steer you. That's this group's purview. Just to put a finer point on it, so land use and zoning, let's just consider them the same thing for right now. They're not the same thing, but we're talking about the colors. So when we're looking at zoning or land use at the top level, that's what we're talking about is the colors. So yellow is almost always residential, red is almost always commercial, green and the blues are oftentimes open space and so on. probably not, this is, a bit presumptuous, but you're probably not going to change the colors on the map to address sea level rise. Not to say that you couldn't. I'm not here to tell you what you could or couldn't do. You could take all the areas that have ever flooded or you think that might flood and look at the maps that show how much sea level rise and say, look, we're going to call this the washaway zone, and we're all going to be like Long Island style beach clubs, where you can't even spend the night there. You can put up your beach cabana. And I'm making this an outrageous suggestion just to illustrate the point. Certainly there are things that you could do that'd be more feasible, but that's probably unlikely. Would you be taking all of someone's property value if they're still allowed to have a little beach cabana on it? No, you wouldn't. So you could debate that, but let's not and save ourselves the time. But most of what you would be talking about and what the city has countenanced in the past is the dimensional requirements when you're looking at site plans, when you're looking at building codes and so on and so forth. Lot coverages, setbacks, elevations, and so on. So now just to wrap it up, really, I think that's the third time I've said that, but I mean it this time. Let's talk about the matters of scale. So this is the 2015 zoning. The map says current zoning, but don't get hung up on that. The current zoning map is available at the city office. But the discussion was how a great amount of Lewis is open space, and that is absolutely true. A good chunk of Lewis is open space. And the beiges, and obviously up along the beach, you have different types of residential and so on. But you are talking about, if you're talking about a regulatory approach to, tinkering with the dimensions of small lots in kind of relatively open areas, amidst, so now keep your eye on Lewis. Now you're going to zoom out to kind of like your little neck of the woods. And now these are the areas that we're talking about. And now we're going to zoom out again to Sussex County. So the points that were made earlier about, the impact that you can have relative to the entire county or the entire state, which all sits astride the Delaware Bay, are probably very valid. So, in summary, what can Lewis control? And thank you for the collaboration between Jen and Janelle for helping me clean this up. But yeah, you have control over your floodplain and where you want to identify as a floodplain. You have control over your wetland regulations and the buffers around them and the type of development that can be done in them. So long as they're at least meeting the state minimums, you can adopt or amend different building codes. We kind of labored the land use type. If you want to only allow beach cabanas anywhere that it might flood, the dimensional characteristics, the annexation, and then of course the review process and the innovation, the review process and annexation. And that's really kind of where I leave off. I mean, I'm sure that there are a number of innovations awaiting thoughtful discovery and discussion, but I kind of leave it where it lies. But I will, if anyone would like me to page back to something, or if they have any questions, if not, I think I'll stop sharing so the group can see each other.
I don't see any questions, so go ahead and, or as of yet, I don't see questions. And again, thank you to BJ. That was a lot to put together in a cohesive way. And as I said, we're not the experts on all of those particular levels, but if you do have a question and we don't know the answer, we're happy to go find it out or make sure it's clarified. But any reactions to that presentation or any specific questions? In the room or not? No? Okay. Hearing none, seeing none, I should say. And just want to leave off by saying our next meeting is on October 12th, where we'll be focusing on the city's existing codes and start and consider the realm of possible solutions. But I know we do have a couple of the members of the public, either online or in person, and I want to make sure that we allow some time for them to ask any questions or make any comments if they have any.
Thanks, Jen. We do have a couple of questions here from people who are.
Would you get a copy of that last presentation?
Copy of the last presentation, Dennis? Yes, that will be available. Correct, Jen?
How would we do that?
Absolutely.
How would we get access to it?
We'll get it to you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Okay, Rick, you wanted to make a comment? Come up.
So Jen, will that be posted on the RCP site?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yes. Well,
Yeah, Nick Carter, I have a property on Lewis Beach, and a couple of comments on the last presentation. The first thing, this might not be the place to talk about it, but I noticed that Sussex County has a 2-height elevation for every foot of freeboard in a floodplain area. Just want to put that on record. That probably relates to the sea level rise subcommittee, not the resiliency committee. But the beginning of the last presentation, there was the government controls, and the first thing that was on the list was shoreline protection and maintenance. And this is being controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. And there was several years ago, was that, Dennis, 5?
4 or 5 years ago.
4 or 5 years ago, we had a nor'easter, a pretty bad one. And all along Lewis Beach, and in fact, even today, there's still some pretty serious cliffs on Lewis Beach. My position is that Lewis Beach is probably, if not number one, the top 3 assets of our community. And if Lewis Beach is the asset of our community, then the Resiliency Committee should really focus on shoreline protection and maintenance. 4 or 5 years ago, when we had a nor'easter that came through for 3 days, we had an 8-foot vertical drop. And we ended up with a meeting. It was Dennis and myself and Ernie Lopez and a few other people, and Ted was there, and Bob Gilligan. And Bob Gilligan actually called Dave Small, who was the secretary of DENREC. And at that time, I don't mean to throw names out, but I won't. There was no plan at that point as to what to do. This was in March. And the horseshoe crabs were coming in May, and then Memorial Day was coming in June, but there was no plan. There was no resiliency plan on what to do. What's the solution for an 8-foot cliff on Lewis Beach? And long story short, Bob Gilligan called the governor, and I think within 36 hours, the DENREC bulldozers were on the beach and rebuilt the dune. So I think that the Resiliency Committee, and I really respect all the time and the effort and the energy and the professionalism here, but I think you need to redirect your focus. The resiliency ordinance that I've read seems to deal with just specific property owners with pervious material and lot coverage, but I think you're missing the big picture. The big picture is, what do we do about shoreline protection and maintenance? And I submitted a document, I think two meetings ago, and the back section of that document had at least 8 different solutions to shoreline protection, shoreline preservation, maintenance, and management. And I think that this committee needs to redirect their focus. The sea level rise, one last comment, the sea level rise issue, I don't dispute sea level rise, but NOAA says that it's 1/8 of 1 inch per year. That's 1 inch in 8 years. That's 1 foot in 96 years. So I think, I'm not disputing sea level rise, but I think it's being over pushed, or it's being emphasized a little too strong. What we're worried about is not so much the sea level rise, 1/8 of an inch per year, but what we're worried about is the flooding. The flooding. And if the sea level rise contributes to additional flooding, then it becomes a part of that. But the flooding is a big problem for Lewis Beach, which again is probably our number 1 asset here in town. So I think the committee really should refocus on the much bigger picture. That's it.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Rick Cole has a question as well.
Yeah, well, it's a question and a comment observation. And thank you all. We have a wonderful community, the participation, whether your opinions are, it goes into the mix and it's appreciated by all. I'm just coming from a point of view of a commercial property owner, marine commercial 1 property, and general commercial another property. The marine commercial is 8,100 square feet. The general commercial I'm partners with is 26,000 square feet. There's no doubt, unless you have your head in the sand, when Bob Dylan sings, it doesn't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. I get all that. I come because I want to stop sounding like a broken record in meeting after meeting. I'm tired of coming to them, but I feel I have to, because I think my voice should be heard, because I have a vested interest along with a lot of other property owners on the beach about their properties. And I'm a big proponent of property rights, but I'm also a proponent of civic interaction and civic responsibility. What's in it for all of us? I can tell you that if any committee or any ordinance or any resolution comes with a stick and not a carrot, it will create problems with property owners. And that's not coming to you and threatening and trying to intimidate. It's a fact. Now, I've heard up there, when Khalil says 53%. My two properties, both my properties, sit on an enormous amount of open land on my property, adjacent to my property. I've always said this. Lewis Beach is a confined area. There's not a lot of more development, new development. There are some new development, in particular one of my properties, but only on 26,000 square feet. That's 0.6 of an acre. In that presentation, and I've been fighting for years about the adherence to the comp plan that a lot of members in this community dedicated a lot of time to, and it was enacted and ratified in 2017, 3 or 4 years ago. And I encourage anybody up there to keep reading and read that comp plan, because I will tell you, on my particular properties, it addresses marine commercial and general commercial properties on the beach side of town. And the takeaway numerous times is the scarcity of it. Incentivize those people who own those properties to develop it. The preceding committee that bore this committee had proposed to lop off from 95% lot coverage. By the way, it sounds enormous, but if you factor in parking and all that, it's not 95%. I couldn't build a 95% build out on my piece of ground, to down to 50%. That is a direct conflict of what the comp plan says about incentivizing the scarcity of the business. I just want people up there to know that I'm not going to keep saying over and over and over again, because this administration hears me over and over again, and they got to get tired of hearing it, and I'm tired of saying it. I will not concede 1 inch of my ground to any ordinance unless we all sit down and talk. And that means the property owners over on the beach, not the ones that have already been built out, they don't have to worry about the new construction. It's the other half of the properties, or whatever the percentage it is, are left to be under the umbrella of any new ordinances. And if anybody can convince me, mathematically or scientifically, that the confined amount of land that would be reserved or taken away from those property owners will amount to a hill of beans in case of any rising sea level, you've got to prove that to me, because with the hundreds or thousands of acres we have, I don't think it's going to make one bit of a difference. The difference is going to be made on the engineering and possibility with porous surfaces and other issues that could be brought to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. I just wanted to add one thing. The Rascal Coffee last Tuesday had a presentation called Risk 2.0, which was presented by FEMA in terms of the new flood insurance regulations. Anybody on this committee, some of you may have participated in it. It was a very interesting presentation about the new floodplain regulations. They didn't have specific dollar amounts, but they did have comments about what we might expect in Delaware in terms of increase in cost of insurance. There's been a lot of concern about how much insurance might rise. This presentation seemed to indicate that with the rise that has been rumored would not be as severe based upon the documents that were developed by this particular program. It might be worth watching if you'd like to go to the Rascal presentation and look at the presentation, which was last Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock.
Great. I see Jim Baker has his hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question, Jen. Are there going to be future presentations regarding regarding potential solutions or regarding what other jurisdictions throughout the state or in other coastal areas have been doing. Not to reinvent the wheel, and I understand Councilman Saliba's comment on not one size fits all, but it would be nice to hear how other coastal communities are attacking some of these issues. And then number two, is there going to be anything from the city's standpoint as far as, to Mr. Carter's points, what is the current plan of attack when storms do occur at the shorelines? And also, I believe I saw in the paper about a month ago that the city and DNREC were help restoring some areas of the coastal marshland. I might be incorrect, but is there information on that and what the city has in the works that may, that would be interesting to the committee to hear and understand?
Okay, great. Two good questions. Thank you. In regards to the second one, as I said, the next meeting in a couple of weeks is going to be on city ordinances, and perhaps we can kind of put that one in the parking lot to be addressed at that time. If there's any other particular information that would be helpful for the committee. In terms of what other communities are doing and have done in regards to flooding and sea level rise, that is certainly something that this planning team can provide an overview of for the committee and provide links and those types of that type of information and research. Absolutely.
Just by way of information, I think most people on this panel are aware that the city does participate in an organization called ACT, which is the Association of Coastal Towns, which is the 7 beachfront communities that run from Lewis to Fenwick. And there also is a sister organization called ABC, the Association of Bay Communities, which runs up the Delaware Bay. And at this point, both the committees have been meeting separately, both with folks from DNREC and other organizations expressing, and Army Corps, so that is ongoing. And next week there'll be a collaborative meeting between the lower ABC members and the upper ACT members to begin to talk about how we can jointly work together to talk to the Army Corps and DNREC about our joint concerns. So there is that municipal joint collaboration going on between communities already. The ACT group is actually about 5 years old at this point, and it had previously existed. It was disbanded for about 10 years, and it was reinvigorated about 5 years ago. And we have been meeting and have had productive conversations with the Army Corps and Secretary Garvin and other members of the DNREC's team, as well as Army Corps. And then separately, there's been an issue which you may have heard on WRDE or any other media, that the four mayors who represent the towns along the Lewis to Rehoboth Canal have written a letter separately to the federal delegation asking that there be interest put forth to have the entire Rehoboth-Lewis Canal dredged from Roosevelt Inlet down to the Delaware Bay, or to the Rehoboth Bay. And that has gotten excellent reception. There was, all 4 of us were able to have a telephone conference call with Lisa Rochester's staff last Friday. So there is an effort going on to work collaboratively amongst the communities already in play.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, Dennis.
Thank you.
Dennis Reardon. I want to congratulate all of you, and what a great job you're doing, and something we need to review. But I'd like to piggyback on what Nick said. I think the beach is very, very important, and when you look at Lewis Beach today versus 20 years ago, in most areas of the beach, it's much more built up than it was. There's a heck of a lot more protection to the homes. 20 years ago when I built my house, and I lived right about in the middle between Savannah Road and the inlet, it was a straight walk from the access right out to the water. And today, there's a really big mound of sand in front of the house with a lot of vegetation which protects it. So I think continuing the maintenance on Lewis Beach would really be a big plus for the city and the homeowners. And again, I like what Nick had to say.
Thank you, Dennis.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Sure, Dick, come on up.
So that, I have a question about the resiliency ordinance. And from what I recall or read, we're trying to restrict the lot coverage to 50% of the lot, and then to use pervious material for driveways and sidewalks and parking lots. And I'm curious that we just had several projects approved. Dutchman's Harvest was one of them. White's Pond was just approved, and I think both of those communities are in the recharge area, I believe.
No.
They're not?
Neither of them.
Neither of them? Neither one?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, that was my question.
There's an undeveloped portion that wasn't part of the old town at White's Pond. There's some land still owned that's undeveloped that does have excellent recharge area in it, but the areas that were part of the development applications were
And
not.
Dutchman's Harvest is not in the recharge
No.
area because it's only about 800 yards from the wellhead.
No, it's outside.
It's outside the recharge area. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments from the committee members or anyone really for the good of the order or in regards to BJ's presentation? No? Okay, well, seeing none, again, just a reminder, our next meeting is October 12th, 4 p.m. Via Zoom. And if you have, I will be uploading today's presentation onto the Dropbox link, and so that it will be posted by tomorrow. And again, thank you all for your thoughtful commentary and participation. It's really helping us all move along. Is there a motion to adjourn? All right.
We've got that everywhere, so.
Understood. Thank you all.
Jen, thank you
Have a good
very
evening.
much. Phil, thank you very much. Appreciate all your work. Thanks, everybody on the committee.
Thank you.
Bye.
This lady came in, got a parking ticket. They said, we paid.